So, in tonight's story, we're introducing you to the 10 most boring outlaws of the Wild West. Welcome to Calm Countdown, where legends don't gallop, they amble. Where history doesn't charge at you with 6 shooters blazing it politely, tips its hat, shuffles its boots, and wonders if maybe we should all just sit down for a while. We make long, slow, gently narrated videos that are designed to help you unwind, zone out, and, if we do our job properly, drift peacefully to sleep. Each episode counts down 10 people, 10 objects, 10 events, each one less thrilling than the last, until you're ready to give up on being awake and tired. If you like what we do, and you want to help keep the lights dimmed and the tumbleweeds rolling, please subscribe, tap the bell icon, and drop a comment with your own ideas for the most yawn-inducing topics you'd like us to cover. It genuinely helps us grow, helps you find us again, and it might just help thousands more people discover the oddly relaxing joy of listening to history's dullest highlights. And tonight's highlights are, well, lowlights. We're riding out into the Old West, not for the famous shootouts or the dangerous escapes, but for the forgotten figures whose criminal careers barely caused a ripple in the dust. These are the outlaws whose biggest claim to fame is how spectacularly ordinary they were. Over the next 10 stories, you'll meet gunfighters who rarely fired their guns, gangs who couldn't plan a successful robbery to save their lives, and desperados whose greatest skill was politely surrendering. From misplaced dynamite to polite stagecoach stick-ups. This is the Wild, so saddle up slowly and join us as we count down the 10 most boring outlaws of the Wild West, from boring to snoring, in 10 facts or less. Let's start our droning tonight with laughing. Sam Carey. He's the 10th most boring outlaw in our list of the Wild West's most forgettable criminals. A man with a nickname that suggested mischief, but a career that barely registered above background noise. Tonight, we begin our countdown with Laughing Sam Carey, an outlaw so low-key that historians aren't entirely sure if he retired, vanished, or simply forgot to come back from lunch. Now, Laughing Sam Carey sounds like the kind of character you'd expect to find propping up the bar in a dime novel. Always ready with a story, a shot of whiskey, and a slightly too loud chuckle. But the reality was more subdued. Carey wasn't a notorious gunfighter or a skilled bank robber. He wasn't even a wanted man in most territories. His connection to the outlaw world came largely through occasional appearances, alongside members of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, a loose collection of criminals operating out of Wyoming in the late 19th century. The Hole-in-the-Wall gang had some colorful characters: Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and others who at least tried to look the part. Carey, however, was more like a recurring extra in their story. He was there sometimes, not there other times. And the historical record mostly shrugs at the question of what he actually did. For storytellers, this makes him frustrating. For calm countdown, it makes him perfect. Breathe in, breathe out. We've got a long ride ahead, and Sam isn't in a hurry. Most outlaws have a moment, a bank robbery, a jailbreak, a shootout in the street. Sam Carey's moment is harder to pin down. Accounts place him in the company of various outlaw gangs, and sometimes, just sometimes, he's said to have been involved in small-time thefts or rustling. But there's no epic heist to speak of. No daring escape from the law. One theory is that Sam's nickname came not from his sense of humor, but from his ability to laugh off the idea of doing actual work, criminal or otherwise. In a time when the frontier was hard living, Sam seemed content to drift. If there was trouble, he could be counted on to quietly leave before it escalated. Pause. Let your shoulders relax. Feel the tension drain away. Just like Sam's motivation to commit serious crime. The Hole-in-the-Wall Pass in Wyoming was a perfect hideout, rugged, remote, with a natural fortress of rock walls and narrow approaches. It became the base for several outlaw groups over the years, each operating independently but sharing the same safe haven. Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch made it famous, but smaller, less organized gangs also came and went. Carey appears in the historical margins here. Sometimes his name shows up in connection with a robbery carried out by others. Sometimes he's mentioned as being part of a group camping in the past, but there's little evidence he took part in the bold or risky parts of outlaw life. More often than not, he seems to have been in the background, maybe tending to the horses, maybe rolling cigarettes, maybe just sitting by the fire, thinking about nothing in particular. If this sounds underwhelming, good. That's the point. Let your eyelids feel heavy. The most interesting and still remarkably boring part of Kara's story is how it ends. In fact, it doesn't. Historical accounts simply stop mentioning him. There's no dramatic last stand, no hanging in the town square, no sensational trial. He just fades out of the record. Some say he left Wyoming and went straight, maybe settling into ranch work or odd jobs in small towns. Others speculate that he wandered further west, living quietly until his death. The absence of detail is almost poetic. A man whose life was so uneventful that historians ran out of things to say, like a candle slowly burning down. Sam Carey's presence in the outlaw world flickered quietly until it went out and no one noticed. Take another slow breath, in and out. You might wonder how someone so uneventful makes it onto our countdown. The truth is, Sam Carey's life reminds us that not every outlaw was a larger-than-life figure. Many were drifters, hangers-on, or opportunists whose lives blurred into the background. Noise of the West. Carey is a perfect example of how the myth of the Wild West overshadows its reality. For every gunslinger who met a dramatic end, there were dozens of men like Sam, quietly present, quietly gone. And that's exactly why he earns his place at number 10. No explosions, no duels, just a man, a nickname, and a career so mild, it's almost meditative. So let's tip our hats to Laughing Sam Carey, not for what he did, but for how little he did it. And with that, we move gently on to number 9. Next, we have the Jennings gang. They're the 9th most boring outlaws in our list. A gang whose robberies were memorable only for how badly they went wrong. The Jennings gang didn't write themselves into legend through daring shootouts or spectacular escapes. They fumbled their way into obscurity, leaving behind a trail of half-empty safes, botched plans, and quiet arrests. The Jennings gang's story starts with a surprising twist. Their leader, Al Jennings, was a lawyer, a practicing, courtroom-walking, case-pleading attorney. At first glance, you might think this gave the gang a cunning legal advantage. After all, who better to exploit loopholes and plan airtight alibis? Unfortunately, the reality was less impressive. Jennings swapped the courtroom for the trail, not because of any grand outlaw calling, but because he lost his temper over a legal dispute. He and his brother Frank decided that the logical next step was to become train robbers. It was a career pivot. Yes, but not a particularly successful one. Breathe in and imagine a man trading in his law books for a saddle, only to discover he's not especially good at crime either. Every outlaw gang dreams of that first big job, the one that sets them up for a life of freedom, infamy, and maybe some new boots. The Jennings gang's first big job ended with them blowing open a train's express safe, only to find it empty, completely devoid of loot. It was the outlaw equivalent of turning up to a buffet after everyone's gone home. They had risked arrest, possibly their lives, for a safe full of air. The gang left the scene poorer than when they arrived, poorer in reputation, poorer in morale, and still very much in need of a paying gig. Let that image settle in. The excitement of the heist, followed by the slow, sinking feeling that you've just committed armed robbery for nothing. Now, to their credit, the Jennings gang didn't give up. They planned more robberies. Unfortunately, persistence was not matched by competence. In one attempt, they stopped a train, made a big show of threatening the staff, and blew open yet another safe. This one contained money, but in an amount so small, it probably didn't cover the cost of their ammunition. Their luck, or lack of it, was becoming a running theme. They were like gamblers who kept putting coins into a slot machine that only ever spat out lint. For listeners drifting towards sleep, imagine the sound of a coin slowly rolling across a wooden floor and disappearing into a corner. That's the Jennings gang's financial trajectory. You'd think that with a former lawyer at the helm, the Jennings gang might have been difficult to catch, but their plans weren't elaborate enough to need unraveling. Law enforcement simply followed the trail of clumsy robberies until they caught up with them. Arrests came, without dramatic standoffs, no blazing gun battles, no desperate last rides into the sunset. Just a slow, procedural process of bringing in criminals who were more nuisance than threat. Imagine a town sheriff leaning in a doorway, sipping coffee, knowing that eventually the Jennings boys would wander back into his jurisdiction by accident. That was roughly the level of urgency. Al Jennings served time, but in a strange twist, ended up running for political office later in life. He even had a brief stint in Hollywood, appearing in a silent film about his own life. The irony, of course, is that the film had to embellish heavily to make his story interesting enough for audiences. It didn't matter how much you polished it. The Jennings gang's record was one of consistent underachievement. Breathe in and let out a slow sigh for the outlaw gang that never quite managed to be more than mildly inconvenient. The Jennings gang earns their spot in this countdown not because they were vicious or legendary, but because they embody the idea of the Wild West outlaw who just wasn't cut out for the job. They lacked planning, they lacked luck, and in the end, they lacked lasting notoriety. Their story is a gentle reminder that even in an era romanticized for danger and adventure, a lot of crime was as uninspired and unproductive as a slow Tuesday afternoon. So here's to the Jennings gang. May their empty safes and short-lived career help you drift into the quietest of dreams. And now, we ride on. Introducing Black Bart. He's the 8th most boring outlaw in our countdown. A man whose stagecoach robberies were carried out with a strange mix of formality and verse. Black Bart was no rampaging gunslinger. He was, in many ways, the literary gentleman of crime, and while that might sound charming, it's a hard act to make exciting when your main weapons are politeness and poetry. Black Bart was born Charles Bolles in England in 1829 and moved to the United States as a child. Like many men of the 19th century, he tried his hand at a variety of occupations: gold mining, ranching, and various odd jobs. None of these careers made him rich, but they did make him mobile. By the 1870s, Bolles had adopted the alias Black Bart, a name that suggested danger, intrigue, and maybe a few pistol duels at dawn. In reality, he seemed more interested in taking long walks in the countryside and keeping his boots polished. Pause here. Imagine a man adjusting his cravat before heading off to rob a coach, not out of necessity, but because it felt like the proper thing to do. Black Bart's crimes were remarkably civilized. He targeted stagecoaches, usually Wells, Fargo shipments, but he went out of his way to avoid physical harm, armed with a shotgun that he never actually fired. He would politely request that drivers hand over their strong boxes. Witnesses reported that he was unfailingly courteous. He didn't shout, didn't threaten unnecessarily, and often reassured his victims that no one would be hurt. In a world where most outlaws relied on intimidation, Black Bart's approach was almost unsettling in its calmness. And yet, as soothing as that sounds for the passengers, it's not the stuff of pulse-quickening legend. No crack of gunfire, no galloping getaway, just a slow, deliberate process of one man asking for a box and then walking away with it. Let your breathing match that pace. Slow, steady, and very, very quiet. What truly set Black Bart apart, however, was his habit of leaving behind poems at the scene of some of his robberies. Written in a neat hand, often with a slightly mocking tone, these verses became his calling card. One example, left in 1877, read, "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." This was not exactly Shakespeare. The rhymes were clumsy, the tone awkward, and the meter questionable at best. But the poems made him memorable, if only because no one else thought to combine verse with theft. For us, it means his crimes have a gentle rhythm to them. You can picture him leaning against a fence post, scribbling in a notebook, pausing to tap his chin, then carefully tucking the poem under the strongbox lid before heading home. From 1875 to 1883, Black Bart robbed at least 28 stagecoaches, often alone, always on foot and without serious injury to anyone involved. His operations were simple. Wait on a remote stretch of road, stop the coach, take the box, and disappear into the hills. He dressed in a long linen duster and a flour sack with eye holes cut out, which sounds ominous, but in practice made him look more like a man avoiding sunburn than a dangerous outlaw. There was no spree of escalating violence, no dramatic lawman rivalry, just a man in a dust coat, repeating the same low-drama routine for years. If you're feeling drowsy, that's entirely appropriate. Black Bart's career ended in 1883 after he left behind a handkerchief with a laundry mark at a robbery scene. Detectives traced it to a San Francisco laundry, then to a respectable boarding house where Charles Bolles was staying. His arrest was as quiet as the rest of his life. No chase, no gunfight, just a knock on the door, a polite conversation, and a gentlemanly surrender. Sentenced to 6 years in San Quentin, he served 4 before being released for good behavior. The newspapers made a modest fuss over his story, but after his release, he slipped back into obscurity. His later life remains uncertain, with some reports claiming he moved to Nevada, others suggesting he died quietly in California. Like a poem that trails off midline, his life simply. Stop Stop Black Bart is proof that an outlaw's legend doesn't have to be thrilling. It can be gently absurd. He robbed dozens of stagecoaches without killing anyone, managed to be oddly likable to his victims, and left behind poetry that's memorable for all the wrong reasons. In a Wild West full of noise and chaos, Black Bart was the soft-spoken man in the corner, stealing your wallet while complimenting your hat. And for that, he earns his place as our 8th most boring outlaw. Now, straighten your dust coat, tip your hat, and let's shuffle on to number 7. Next, we have the Innocents. They're the 7th most boring outlaws in our countdown, mostly because we can't even be certain they were outlaws at all. The Innocents were allegedly a gang of stagecoach robbers and murderers in Montana during the early 1860s, or they were simply the unfortunate subjects of one man's very dramatic storytelling. Either way, the result is the same. Their historical record is so thin, and their alleged crimes so inconsistently reported, that they've ended up here, in a list dedicated to the West's most underwhelming desperados. The story of the Innocents comes primarily from Thomas Dinsdale, a school teacher turned newspaper editor in Virginia City, Montana. In 1866, he published a book called The Vigilantes of Montana, which described in vivid and occasionally lurid detail a gang of outlaws supposedly responsible for dozens of murders and robberies. According to Dinsdale, the Innocents operated along the road between Virginia City and Bedtime, robbing gold shipments and stagecoaches, and generally terrorizing travelers. He claimed they had as many as 100 members and were led by a man named Henry Plummer, who, inconveniently for history, was also the sheriff of Bannack. It's a thrilling tale, but one with a small problem. Almost no contemporary evidence backs it up. Take a slow breath in and out, because we're not in for much action here. Henry Plummer is the most famous figure connected to the Innocents. A native of Maine, he moved west in the 1850s, worked as a miner, and served as Marshal of Nevada City, California, until he was convicted of murder in 1857. After a pardon in 1859, he drifted to Montana and was elected sheriff in 1863. Book paints Plummer as the criminal mastermind behind the Innocents, using his badge as cover for his illegal operations. The image is compelling. A lawman by day, gang leader by night. The trouble is, no official records from the time prove the gang's existence beyond Dinsdale's narrative. Some historians now argue that the Innocents may have been entirely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, perhaps as a way to justify vigilante justice. This means our 7th most boring outlaw group might have been entirely fictional, which, when you think about it, is about as boring as it gets. What isn't in dispute is that, in early 1864, a group of vigilantes hanged more than 20 men in and around Virginia City, including Henry Plummer, These executions were carried out without trials, based largely on the belief, fueled by Dinsdale's claims, that these men were part of the innocents. The vigilantes acted swiftly, decisively, and with little regard for due process. From a storytelling perspective, this should be the climactic point, a confrontation between good and evil. But when your evil might not even have existed, it starts to feel less like high drama and more like an awkward misunderstanding. Pause. Imagine being accused of running a sprawling criminal empire, only for history to shrug and say, well, maybe. Subsequent historians have pored over court documents, newspaper archives, and mining camp records looking for proof of the innocents' activities. The results have been thin. Some robberies did occur in the area during the early 1860s, and it's entirely plausible that a loose network of criminals was responsible. But the scale and organization described by Dinsdale seem increasingly unlikely. One theory suggests that the vigilantes, many of whom were prominent local businessmen, used the gang narrative as a way to consolidate power and eliminate political rivals. If true, this would make the innocents less a fearsome outlaw band and more a convenient myth. In the end, the innocents earned their place as the seventh most boring outlaws of the Wild West because their very existence is questionable. You can't get much duller than a gang that might be a figment of someone's imagination, especially when that imagination belonged to a Victorian school teacher with a flair for melodrama. They remind us that history isn't just about what happened, it's also about what people said happened. And sometimes, the gap between the two is wide enough to ride a stagecoach through. So here's to the innocents, the only outlaw gang in our countdown, whose most impressive heist was stealing space in the history books without leaving any clear evidence behind. And now, let's drift onward to number 6 on our list of the 10 most boring Wild West outlaws. So now let me introduce Bill Downing, the 6th most boring outlaw in our countdown. A man whose reputation for unpleasantness outweighed his actual achievements in crime. Bill Downing was one of those rare figures who managed to be disliked by lawmen, citizens, and fellow criminals alike, not because of his dangerous exploits, but because he was, well, simply annoying. William Bill Downing was born in Texas, sometime in the mid-19th century. Details about his early life are patchy, not because they're lost to history, but because they were so unremarkable that no one bothered to write them down. Downing drifted westward, eventually landing in Arizona territory. He did the usual: frontier jobs, ranch hand, cowboy, but somehow managed to rub nearly everyone the wrong way. Accounts describe him as surly, quarrelsome, and generally unpleasant company. This wasn't the kind of bad attitude that made him a dangerous legend. It was more like the sort of personality that gets you uninvited from card games. Take a slow breath. Imagine the dull ache of sitting next to someone in a saloon who complains about the temperature of the whiskey for 20 straight minutes. That's the level of energy we're dealing with here. Downing's biggest brush with outlaw fame came from his association with the Doolin Dalton gang, sometimes called the Wild Bunch. No, not that Wild Bunch. There were several. This loose group of outlaws occasionally robbed trains in the 1890s, and Downing was sometimes in their orbit. But while other members committed daring holdups, Downing's role appears to have been peripheral. He may have helped plan one or two jobs. He may have been on hand for part of a robbery, or he may have just been around when people were talking about robberies. The records aren't clear, which is historians speak for weird. Not sure he actually did anything. In other words, Bill Downing had all the trappings of an outlaw without much of the action. One of Downing's few documented crimes occurred in Tucson, Arizona, where he attempted to rob a post office. Not a bank, not a payroll coach. A post office, the hall. Modest at best. There's no record of him making off with gold or large sums of money. It seems more likely he ended up with a small amount of cash, some stamps, and perhaps a few angry glares from postal workers. It's difficult to picture anyone writing a thrilling dime novel about this heist. Chapter 7. The slightly inconvenienced mail clerk. Pause and breathe. Even your pulse probably hasn't changed in the last 2 minutes, and neither would it have if you'd been there that day. What makes Downing truly stand out, in the dullest way possible, was his ability to alienate just about everyone. Other outlaws didn't trust him. Townsfolk disliked him. Law enforcement officers treated him with suspicion, not just because of his past, but because he seemed like the kind of man who might pick a fight over the color of your boots. Some historians have suggested that Downing's real talent was survival. While more active outlaws were dying in gunfights or swinging from gallows, Downing avoided high-stakes situations. Whether this was deliberate caution or sheer laziness is unclear. In 1908, Downing's life came to an unremarkable end. He was shot and killed by a lawman in a saloon in Pierce, Arizona. The incident was not the climax of a long pursuit or the final act of a notorious crime spree. It was simply the result of Downing threatening the wrong man after a night of drinking. No posse chase. No dramatic last words. Just a short, sharp end to a long, low-key career. Take another slow breath in and out, and let that anticlimax settle over you like a worn blanket. Bill Downing earns his place as the sixth most boring outlaw of the Wild West for embodying the opposite of romantic outlaw spirit. He didn't have a spectacular string of crimes. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He was just unpleasant to be around and occasionally involved in petty theft. In a world where history remembers the loudest and the boldest, Downing is proof that sometimes the quiet, irritating ones slip into the record too, not because they were remarkable, but because they were there. And now we ride slowly, very slowly, on to number 5 in our list of most boring Wild West outlaws. So, now we move on to Cherokee Bill, the 5th most boring outlaw in our countdown of 10 most boring Wild West outlaws. And before you protest, yes, Cherokee Bill had a few moments of genuine outlaw behavior, but compared to the legends of the Wild West, his career was brief, patchy, and somehow managed to end before he ever really got going. His name promises excitement, but the reality is a short story padded with long stretches of inactivity, perfect for anyone looking to drift off before the next chapter begins. Cherokee Bill was born Crawford, Goldsbury in 1876 at Fort Cumpton, Texas. His father was African American and had served in the U.S. Army's 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. His mother was of Cherokee descent, which is how he acquired the nickname that would follow him into infamy. Growing up in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, Goldsbury had a mixed upbringing that exposed him to military discipline on one side and the rough frontier life on the other. But rather than gradually working his way into a life of crime, he seemed to leap into it almost by accident. At the age of 18, after an argument with his stepbrother, he shot and killed him. This act pushed him out of lawful society and into the company of outlaws. But it wasn't part of any grand plan. It was more the result of bad temper and worse judgment. Pause, breathe. This isn't the calculated rise of a criminal genius. It's a teenage overreaction that accidentally sets the course for the rest of his life. After fleeing the scene, Goldsbury fell in with the Cook gang, led by Bill and Jim Cook. This group had a reputation for train and store robberies. Though reputation here might be an overstatement, they were more of a regional nuisance than a national threat. Cherokee, Bill took part in a few of their jobs, including the occasional train robbery, but these were rarely the cinematic kind. No great shootouts, no daring escapes across open plains. More often than not, the Cook gang relied on quick in-and-out jobs, taking what they could and disappearing before anyone had time to organize a response. Even the gang's train robberies lacked flair. They weren't blowing safes or stealing vast amounts of gold. Sometimes they took cash, sometimes just mailbags. Occasionally, if things went badly, they left with very little at all, the kind of results that don't inspire ballads and certainly don't keep you awake at night over the next year or so. Cherokee Bill's criminal record included store robberies, post office burglaries, and the occasional murder, though not in the romanticized gunslinger duel way. His killings tended to be the result of disputes or panic rather than calculated ambushes. For example, during one store robbery, He shot and killed a man simply because the man didn't move fast enough. This wasn't the mark of a clever outlaw. It was the behavior of someone making poor decisions on impulse. It made him dangerous. Yes, but also unpredictable. And unpredictability rarely translates into long-term outlaw success. Take another. Slow breath. Imagine a man playing a card game, losing, and then appending the table rather than learning the rules. That's the energy Cherokee Bill brought to his career by 1895. Cherokee Bill's short spree was coming to an end. A $1,300 reward was offered for his capture, a respectable sum, but nowhere near the bounties placed on more notorious figures. His arrest came not in a cinematic chase, but in a surprisingly subdued confrontation. Surrounded by lawmen, he was coaxed into surrendering by a woman, his own half-sister, who persuaded him to give himself up rather than be shot. No last stand, no heroic bullet-dodging getaway, just a conversation and a quiet walk into custody. Once imprisoned at Fort Smith, Arkansas, Cherokee Bill did briefly make his story more exciting, but only for a moment. During his trial for one of his murders, he smuggled a gun into court, attempted an escape, and killed a guard in the process. It's the sort of event that should make a career more memorable. But in Bill's case, it was over almost as soon as it began. He was recaptured immediately, and any drama fizzled out before it could spark. In March 1896, at the age of just 20, Cherokee Bill was hanged. His reported last words were, "I came here to die, not to make a speech." And that was that career over before most outlaws had even reached their peak. Cherokee Bill's short career earns him the number 5 spot not because he was harmless. He was certainly violent, but because his time as an outlaw was a brief, scattered series of bad decisions without the longevity or panache of the true legends. His crimes were serious, but his legacy is thin. Without the name Cherokee Bill, most of his actions would blur into the long list of young men who fell foul of the law in the West, and disappeared from memory soon after. In the great Western myth, he's a flicker, there and gone again, leaving just enough behind for a name, but not enough for a saga. And now, let's ride on to number 4 in our Top 10.com countdown of the most boring Wild West outlaws. And now, we move on to Longhair Jim Courtright, who is the 4th most boring outlaw in our countdown. A man with the wonderfully theatrical nickname, Longhair Jim, and a resume that straddled both sides of the law, yet somehow left us, with a career that was less epic Western and more beige frontier office drama. If this were a movie, you'd expect sweeping plains, duels at high noon, and dramatic betrayals. Instead, Longhair Jim's story is about half-remembered gunfights, dull stretches of municipal work, and the kind of reputation that's impressive until you look too closely. Timothy Isaiah Courtright, known to everyone as Jim, was born in Illinois in 1848. He served briefly in the Union Army during the Civil War, then drifted west like so many young men looking for opportunity. The nickname Longhair was not metaphorical. He actually wore his hair long, shoulder length, and reportedly well. It was a rare touch of flamboyance in an otherwise unremarkable personality. In photographs, he looked like someone trying to be a mix between Wild Bill Hickok and a stern bank clerk. Breathe in and imagine a man who has a signature look, but not much of a signature story. That's Jim in a nutshell. Courtright's most notable official role was as the city marshal of Fort Worth, Texas. From 1876 to 1879, his job was to maintain order in a town with a rough Hell's half-acre red light district. And to be fair, he did clean up the streets, but not in the cinematic way you'd expect. There were no legendary shootouts or daring arrests. His tenure involved more paperwork, patrolling, and politely telling drunken cowboys to keep their voices down. Later rumors suggested he might have run a protection racket while in office, offering safety in exchange for payments from saloon and brothel owners, but the evidence is hazy, and like much in his story, it sounds more interesting than it actually was. After leaving office, Courtright drifted into less lawful work. He reportedly tried his hand at being a hired gun, land enforcer, and debt collector. But unlike the Outlaws, whose reputations grew with each daring act, Courtright's activities seemed to exist in a gray zone, neither fully criminal nor entirely respectable. He was armed, he was willing to threaten people, but there's little record of him pulling off major heists, robberies, or gang activity. If anything, he was more like a freelance intimidator, the kind of figure who might show up to remind you about an unpaid bill and then leave without firing a shot. Pause. Let that image drift through your mind. The man with the long hair, leaning on the bar, giving you a stern look about your overdue rent. Not exactly ballad material. If Courtright is remembered for anything, it's his fatal gunfight with Luke Short in 1887. This was a rare moment of actual Western drama in his otherwise tepid career, and even this, when you dig into it, is over in less than the time it takes to yawn. The confrontation happened outside the White Elephant Saloon in Fort Worth. Accounts vary, but the gist is that Courtright tried to confront Short, possibly over a protection payment dispute. Words were exchanged. Courtright reportedly went for his gun, but it snagged on his watch chain, giving Short the moment he needed to draw and fire first. 3 shots later, Longhair Jim was dead. That's it. No drawn-out exchange of bullets. No crowd-pleasing heroics. Just a quick, awkward end caused, in part, by poor holster management. After his death, Courtright's reputation ballooned. Some accounts claim he killed multiple men in gunfights. Others say he was feared across Texas. But the documented record doesn't support much of that. It's a common Wild West phenomenon. The legend grows after the man is gone. And in Jim's case, the legend makes him sound far more exciting than the evidence allows. In life, he was a middling lawman, a moderately effective enforcer, and a victim of one quick gunfight. Breathe out slowly. If your pulse is still steady, you're right in step with Courtright's actual pace. Longhair Jim Courtright earns the number 4 spot, because he perfectly represents that gap between image and reality in the Old West. His hair was long, his legend was tall, but the facts are about as flat as the Texas plains. He didn't rob trains. He didn't lead gangs. He didn't leave a trail of daring escapades. He mostly held a badge, held a grudge, and eventually held the short end of a gunfight. And now, with hair unruffled and stories slightly deflated, we move on to number 3. So, let me introduce you to Dynamite Dan Clifton, the 3rd most boring outlaw in our countdown of the most boring Wild West outlaws. And, with a nickname like Dynamite Dan, you'd expect fire, destruction, and high-stakes robberies that shook the frontier. Instead, what you get is a man whose supposed explosive talents never really went off. He was more of a damp sparkler than a stick of TNT, and by the end, his most famous moment wasn't something he did, but something that happened to him. Don Clifton was born around 1865 in Texas. Very little is known about his early life, which usually hints at either a mysterious past or a very ordinary one. In Clifton's case, the evidence suggests it was the latter. The Dynamite Don nickname came from his alleged skill with explosives, especially in blowing open safes during robberies. The problem is, there are precious few confirmed instances of him actually using dynamite effectively. It's the Old West equivalent of calling someone lightning because they once lit a campfire in under a minute. So already, we have a brand that promises more than it delivers. Breathe in and imagine a long fuse burning, and burning, and burning, until it fizzles out in a sad puff of smoke. That's Dan's career in miniature. Clifton's outlaw career was mostly tied to petty crimes, small-time robberies, minor thefts, and the occasional holdup. He drifted in and out of different gangs, sometimes working with more famous figures, but never leading, never masterminding, and rarely making headlines. He was reportedly part of a gang that robbed trains and banks in Texas and Oklahoma, but when you dig into the records, his name is often just one in a list of participants, and sometimes not there at all. This wasn't Jesse James territory. It wasn't even Kid Curry territory. It was the outlaw equivalent of working casual shifts. You turn up when there's a job, do your part, and go home without anyone remembering your name. Using dynamite in robberies wasn't exactly rare in the late 19th century, but it was risky. Too little explosive, and you just dented the safe. Too much, and you blew the contents to pieces. There are no surviving stories of Clifton pulling off a flawless dynamite job. There are, however, whispers that his technique was inconsistent. One robbery left the target completely untouched because the charges failed to ignite. Another supposedly destroyed most of the loot, along with the safe. In other words, his primary selling point as an outlaw, his so-called special skill, may have been more liability than asset. Take another slow breath. Imagine hiring a man called Chef Tony, who burns the toast half the time. That's the frustration his fellow criminals might have felt. Like many small-time outlaws, Clifton's life was one of constant movement. He never stayed in one place too long, partly to avoid lawmen, and partly because he never seemed to have enough steady work, even in crime. There are reports of him doing occasional ranch work between robberies, which doesn't exactly match the romanticized image of the gunslinger. Picture him leaning on a fence, watching cattle graze, while somewhere a bard tries to write a song about his wild life. And so the years rolled on, with Clifton's reputation being inflated mostly by his nickname rather than any particularly daring deeds. Here's where Dynamite Dan's story takes its most memorable and ironically boring turn. In 1896, lawmen were desperate to catch him. A $50 reward was offered for his capture, dead or alive. That may sound modest compared to the huge bounties placed on legendary outlaws, but it was enough to tempt bounty hunters and opportunists. And so, one day, Clifton was gunned down by a man named Joe Hunter. Hunter claimed the reward. But the thing that made the killing truly famous wasn't the capture itself. It was the gruesome, almost absurd, display of Clifton's body. Hunter cut off one of Clifton's hands and sent it to the authorities as proof of his death. The severed hand was displayed in public, drawing far more attention than Clifton's actual life ever had. Pause for a moment. Imagine your most lasting legacy being not your deeds, but your dismembered hand sitting in a jar for strangers to gawk at. Dynamite Dan Clifton earns his place at number 3 because his career is a textbook case of mismatched branding. His name suggested chaos, danger, and explosive action. The reality was a few small robberies, some questionable use of dynamite, and a death that only became memorable because of one gruesome detail. He wasn't the most feared outlaw. He wasn't the most successful. He wasn't even the most competent with his supposed speciality. He was just there, and in the Wild West. Being just there is a surprisingly effective way to end up here. In our countdown of the most boring outlaws, and now, as the fuse burns low and the dust settles, we move to number 2 in our not-so-exciting calm countdown. Woo-woo, we're nearly there. Congratulations on sticking with this so far. Let me introduce you to the second most boring outlaw in our countdown, HooDoo Brown. On paper, HooDoo Brown should have been a frontier villain of epic proportions. He was the leader of the so-called Dodge City gang in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He controlled law enforcement. He had political influence. He ran the town like his own personal fiefdom. And yet, instead of becoming a blood-soaked legend of the Old West, HooDoo's career was mostly a story of corruption, bad bookkeeping, and a quiet fade into obscurity. If Jesse James was a storm, HooDoo Brown was a damp morning mist, mildly unpleasant, but hardly headline-making. Born Hyman G. Neill around 1856 in Lexington, Kentucky, HooDoo Brown's early years were unremarkable. He drifted through a variety of jobs: printer, gambler, buffalo hunter, and saloon worker. None of them made much of an impression on history. The HooDoo nickname supposedly came from his uncanny bad luck, or perhaps the bad luck he brought to others. Either way, it's not the sort of name that inspires awe. Here comes HooDoo sounds less like a threat and more like a warning that your poker hand is about to go sour. By the late 1870s, HooDoo had settled in Las Vegas, New Mexico, a town that was booming thanks to the arrival of the railroad, with opportunity in the air and saloons on every corner. HooDoo somehow became the justice of the peace and coroner. This was the genius of his operation. Rather than robbing banks outright, he filled the key law enforcement roles with his own. associates the so-called Dodge City Gang, and then profited from controlling the system. It's a clever setup, but here's the problem. It doesn't make for thrilling Western action. There are no legendary standoffs, no rooftop chases, no train robberies under the moonlight. Just paperwork, bribes, and an endless supply of quiet, shady deals. Pause for a moment. Imagine a man in a dusty office, leaning back in a creaky chair, slowly signing fraudulent warrants. That's our outlaw at work, HooDoo's double role. Upholding the law while quietly breaking it gave him a certain level of control over Las Vegas. His gang would arrest travelers, often on trumped-up charges, confiscate their valuables, and then release them without trial. It was corruption on a local scale, but it lacked the romance of true outlawry. HooDoo didn't ride with a mask over his face, guns blazing. He didn't gallop away into the desert night with the posse on his tail. He just quietly took your stuff and signed a few papers to make it look official. As is often the case with mild corruption, things eventually got out of hand. HooDoo's men became more brazen. Killings were attributed to the gang. Public opinion turned against them. By 1880, the citizens of Las Vegas had had enough. A vigilante group formed, and HooDoo, sensing that his luck was running out, decided to leave town. No grand shootout, no dramatic arrest. He simply packed up and left, which, in fairness, is the safest and most boring way to end a reign of questionable authority. After leaving New Mexico, HooDoo Brown's trail becomes hazy. There were rumors of him turning up in various states, Texas, Mexico, and even as far away as Alaska. Some claimed he reinvented himself as a gambler, others that he became a lawman again. The truth is, no one really knows. And that, oddly enough, is the perfect ending for someone in our countdown. A man who could have been infamous, but instead just wandered away. HooDoo Brown earns the number 2 spot because his career had all the ingredients for Western infamy, but managed to serve them up in the least exciting way possible. He had power, a gang, and the law on his side, and yet he left behind no famous robberies, no epic duels, and no cinematic escapes. Instead, his reign was a slow-moving haze of bribes, dodgy arrests, and convenient disappearances. He was a master of turning action into inaction, and in the Wild West, that's a special kind of boring. And now, as the tumbleweeds roll and the final chapter beckons, we reach the number 1 spot, the most boring outlaw of them all. And finally, here he is, the number 1 spot in our countdown of the 10 most boring outlaws of the Wild West. His name was Joseph Alfred Slade, but everyone knew him as Jack Slade. At first glance, his life sounds tailor-made for dime novels. Stagecoach, superintendent, feared gunman, frontier figure. But when you start peeling back the layers of legend, what you find is a career made up of long, tedious stretches of supervisory work, the occasional unverified rumor of violence, and an ending that was more pitiful than dramatic. If our list has taught us anything, it's that the Wild West produced just as many mild disappointments as it did legends, and Slade, despite having one of the most menacing reputations of his day, may be the crown prince of anticlimax. Jack Slade was born in 1831 in Illinois. He served in the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War, but there are no stirring battlefield accounts or heroic charges in his record. He was a soldier in a war where thousands served, nothing more. Nothing less. After the war, he drifted west and found work with the Overland Stage Company, eventually becoming a division. Superintendent, if that title sounds more like a railroad desk job than outlaw territory, you're not far off. Picture it, Slade riding along dusty routes, making sure stage stations had enough feed for the horses, checking timetables, and inspecting wagons. For maintenance issues, in the Grand Theater of the Wild West, he was basically middle management. Take a slow breath and imagine watching a man count harness straps for inventory. That's where the legend begins. Slade's reputation as a dangerous man comes largely from one incident in 1859, the killing of Jules Bainey, a former station keeper with whom Slade had a personal grudge. Accounts vary wildly. Some say it was a cold-blooded ambush, others that it was a fair fight. Either way, Slade shot Baney, and then, according to some versions, mutilated the body. It's a grisly story, but here's the problem. That one violent act became the foundation for Slade's entire fearsome image. Beyond it, there's little hard evidence that he was involved in other killings. Yet dime novels and campfire tales inflated the story until Slade was supposedly a ruthless gunfighter who had slain dozens. The reality, one confirmed kill and a lot of managerial paperwork. From 1859 to the early 1860s, Slade was in charge of a large section of the overland stage route in Wyoming and Nebraska territory. This meant supervising hundreds of miles of stage stops, hiring and firing workers, managing payroll, and dealing with the occasional troublemaker along the trail. It was important work, sure, but exciting. Not so much. Most days probably consisted of mundane travel, letters to headquarters, and long conversations about feed costs. There's no record of him leading posse chases, robbing trains, or holding up banks. Instead, he was known for keeping the mail running on time, which is admirable but not exactly pulse-quickening. Breathe out slowly, and picture the excitement of filling out supply requisitions by lamplight. Slade's downfall had less to do with shootouts and more to do with whiskey. In the early 1860s, his drinking increased, and with it came erratic behavior. Reports say he'd fire his guns in town just to make a scene or get into loud arguments with local merchants. Still, even his drunken antics lacked the scale of true outlaw mayhem. There are no famous robberies or multi-day manhunts in his history. Just the occasional night of overindulgence and some property damage. By 1864, his behavior had worn thin with the townspeople of Virginia City, Montana. On March 10, 1864, the citizens of Virginia City had had enough. A group of vigilantes arrested Slade, not for murder, not for robbery, but for disorderly conduct. He was hanged later that day. The decision was made quickly, without a formal trial, and even some who disliked him thought the punishment was excessive, and that's the climax of his story. A feared outlaw brought down not by a legendary gunfight, but by being allowed drunk in the wrong town at the wrong time. Take a deep, slow breath and let that anticlimax sink in. The most feared man in Montana territory ended his life dangling from a rope because people were tired of his behavior, not because he was the West's greatest criminal mastermind. Jack Slade earns the #1 spot because his legend is a perfect example of how the Wild West myth machine could turn a fairly ordinary, even dull life into a larger-than-life saga. He had one notable killing, a lot of managerial duties, and a fatal weakness for alcohol. Yet, in the retelling, he became a ruthless gunslinger. Strip away the exaggerations, and you're left with a man who spent more time arranging horse feed than robbing banks, and whose most dangerous weapon might have been a bottle of whiskey. And so, we close our countdown of the 10 most boring outlaws of the Wild West with a man whose story is 10% action, 90% administration, and 100% proof that not every legend deserves their reputation. If you stayed awake this long, congratulations. You've survived the slowest ride through outlaw history that you're likely to take this year. And so there we have it. 10 dusty, slow-moving, anticlimactic tales from the Old West. 10 men whose lives promised adventure but delivered something closer to an interrupted afternoon nap. From stagecoach schedules to failed dynamite jobs. From polite holdups to outlaw leaders who preferred sitting behind a desk. These were the forgotten footnotes of frontier crime. Proof that the Wild West wasn't all blazing saddles and high-noon duels. Sometimes it was just paperwork, bad weather, and the occasional awkward misunderstanding. If you enjoyed this countdown, or even if you barely noticed it playing in the background while you drifted off, then go ahead and subscribe. It helps you find us again, it helps the channel grow, and it means you'll never miss another carefully underwhelming journey into history's least exciting corners. And we want to hear from you. In the comments, tell us, which of these outlaws was your favorite or your least favorite? Which yawn-worthy moments did you secretly enjoy? And most importantly, what boring topic should we tackle next? Your idea might just be the next episode that lulls thousands into a peaceful slumber. Until next time, this has been Calm Countdown. From boring to snoring, in 10 facts or less. Now, take one last slow breath and let the trail fade into silence.